welcome to another recording for Bradford for Better. This time we've got Professor Neil Small, Emeritus Professor of Health Research at the University of Bradford, has published several books, chapters and scientific papers, supervised many PhDs, and is a long-standing member of the Born in Bradford Executive Committee. Neil, welcome to this recording. How are you today?
I'm very well, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. And nice to see you, albeit online.
Yeah, online, so we can record it and then hopefully share it with members of the public who are interested in this. So today we're talking, I mean, we could talk about so many different things, but today we're talking about consanguineous marriages, or in shorthand, cousin marriages, and focusing a little bit about what the research tells us from Born in Bradford. But before we start that, Neil, I just want to highlight that Born in Bradford focuses on so many different aspects of people's lives. So it focuses on nutrition, language, maternal health, physical health, mental health, focuses on green spaces, air quality, focuses on income and health, housing and health, epidemiology, so many different things. Why would you, what do you think are the reasons for the media's interest, fairly disproportionate interest, I could sometimes say, in this subject of cousin marriages? What do you think that's down to?
Well, I think that the first thing to say is that there's a great deal of interest because this is a really important and informative study for all those people that are interested in genetic health. Across the world, there are communities where it's customary to marry blood relations, most specifically cousins. Customary means in the scientific literature where more than about 20% of the population would marry their cousins. And across the world, in all sorts of communities, there are about 1 billion people that live in such societies. And
Mhm.
what's been found in those societies over the years is that the levels of recessive genetic disorder, and I'll say a bit more about what they are later, but levels of recessive disorder are higher than they are in countries that don't have that sort of uh, pattern of customary cousin marriage. So a study like Born in Bradford has a tremendous capacity to inform a debate that's valid and important for people across the world when they're thinking about things that are impacting on people's health and thinking about ways of actually addressing those. That's the first thing to say. So Born in Bradford is really useful and important worldwide resource for the sorts of concerns that people have about genetic health. The second thing is, I think recessive genetic disorders often manifest in very young children. Most children who have a recessive disorder will be diagnosed before the age of 1. And a number of children die, and a number of children have serious illnesses associated with recessive disorders. This is a thing that raises people's levels of awareness and concern. And one of the reasons I think why there's an interest in the particular subject of genetic health. The other and allied reason I think with that is that there is a sense I think in some of the public debate that it's a pretty simple thing to think about responding to. There's a
Mhm.
belief that genetic illness is, in a sense, a sort of single cause condition and one that can easily be dealt with. And I
Mhm.
think the press get caught up a little into thinking there are easy answers here. It's pretty simple. If marrying a blood relation increases your chance of having a recessive disorder, then let's not marry cousins
Mhm.
without thinking about the social context of those sorts of choices that are made and without thinking of the complexities that are involved in trying to understand the relationship between genetic risk and childhood illness. So, some very positive reasons. I think Born in Bradford is making a major contribution. I think that's widely recognized. Some things that are more to do with a sort of sense of the upset that genetic illness produces, and some to do with an idea that this is a sort of simple thing that we could sort out easily, and why aren't we?
Yeah, really helpful answers there. And Neil, it's really good that you've highlighted that this is quite widespread across the globe. And even when we the act of the prevalence of cousin marriages, but also even historically, some notable figures such as Einstein and Darwin were, you know, they were involved in cousin marriages as well, weren't they?
Yeah, and custom marriages have been in the historical past
Mm,
common in the UK and common across Europe. They are still common in a number of communities.
hmm
Um, Many of them now around North Africa, the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, Pakistan, and others concentrated not so much in geographic regions, but in population groups. So some people who live in Roma communities, for example, would have higher rates of cousin marriage, and some communities that are very isolated, isolated rural communities, island communities may have rates of cousin marriage that are higher than the average. This is a complex world picture and
hmm
one that does change historically over time. I know there's a great deal of talk about the historic past in the UK. The royal family, for example,
hmm
has quite a history of cousin marriage. But currently, and in the Born in Bradford study, the prevalence of cousin marriage within white British families in Born in Bradford was almost zero. So, in
hmm
terms of the contemporary understanding of this in Bradford and in the UK at the moment, rates of cousin marriage, white British populations, very, very low.
Yeah. So I think it'd be really useful if you describe what a birth cohort study is, for example, what Born in Bradford is, and how does it go and find data, and how does it scientifically contribute some knowledge to this? So just for the benefit of our listeners, how does Born in Bradford operate?
Well, Born in Bradford's a birth cohort study, and what that means is it's a study that takes a population, in this case, a population, a particular place at a particular time. So, Born in Bradford invited all mothers who were registered to give birth at Bradford Royal Infirmary between 2007 and 2011. They invited them all to join a study which would begin to look at the relationship between the circumstances of their lives when their child is born and the emerging environment in which the child grows up. And would do that throughout the childhood, throughout the child's uh, life until they were becoming adults, ideally. Now, the idea of that is that much scientific study is done on particular populations with particular illnesses. And while that's really useful, it doesn't give a picture of the emergence of illness in a population. And it doesn't give that sort of background context that describes why particular illnesses arrive, why they arrive in the sorts of patterns that they do, what impact they have on populations. If you take a population, in this case in the city of Bradford, and you say, join the study and we'll follow these children up, you look at how things like their housing, the level of poverty in the community, the sorts of environmental things that impact upon children's lives, begin to shape the sorts of health, education, and well-being experience of those children as you grow up. You get, in a sense, that full picture. We know that some things are caused, some illnesses are caused by single conditions, but in general, health is a product of the sum total of those things that exist around a child's life. Now, we've known this for a long time, and birth cohorts have a long history, and certainly a proud history in the UK, when there have been a number of leading birth cohort studies over a number of years, but not
hmm
just in the UK. Across the world, there are places where are either taking a sample of people, a random sample to reflect the population, and following up their health over years. In the UK, the Millennium Study, for example, follows children born in the Millennium year. So those children are now
hmm
growing up, um, or are focusing on particular cities. There's a very important and influential study based in the city of Bristol in the UK. Across the world, there's an exciting study in South Africa looking at children called the Mandela's Children Study, which is looking at those children born around that point at which South Africa threw off apartheid. There are studies in Scandinavia, in
Hmm.
Australia and the United States, and so on. This is a worldwide phenomenon. All these studies get together, incidentally, and compare notes and sometimes compare findings to increase the importance and power of the studies. But this is a way of saying if we want to understand health,
Hmm.
we've got to look at all those things that surround a person's life and pick from those things that are significant as in this case, as the children grow older.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and it's good that you highlighted it's been going on for so many years. So the first one in the UK was the 1946 birth cohort study, and I guess what they all have in common is they follow people for as long as is possible and look for patterns in populations to describe why certain things are happening to a certain population and try and put some, I guess, explanations around that or explore that a little bit further. So that's what Born in Bradford does. How many people are in the Born in Bradford cohort?
At the point when we recruited people,
Mm,
there were 13,776 pregnancies. Now,
mhm,
that accounted for the vast majority of people being cared for at the Bradford Royal Infirmary.
mhm,
Most of those people, most of those mums, mums who were recruited in the first place, but most of those mums and then their children are still in the study all those years later. So we've watched these children go through their infancy and childhood now into their school years, and some getting towards the end of their school years. The One of the key things here is people born at the Bradford Royal Infirmary. So there are Bradfordians who were not born at the Bradford Royal Infirmary who are not involved in the
mhm,
study. Some people were picked up later, home birth people, but those people in the Bradford Metropolitan District who were cared for at Airedale, for
mhm.
example, were not part of the Born in Bradford study.
Yeah. Mhm. That's really helpful, Neil. So, going back to the subject of consanguineous marriages, from the Born in Bradford study, what would you say are the two most important things that you found from the data in Born in Bradford?
Going back to my earlier point about the worldwide significance of Born in Bradford,
Hmm.
the worldwide significance comes from the fact that of the 13,776 pregnancies,
Hmm.
just a majority were to mothers of Pakistani heritage, and the rest, considerable majority of the rest, were to white British mothers. So we have, in a sense, two very big groups of roughly even size in this particular cohort study. Um, and what that allows us to do is compare with large numbers the sorts of experience of the Pakistani heritage population in contrast to the white British population, for example, which is something I think that doesn't exist in any other studies, any other birth cohort study in the world. Now, so of the people recruited, of the mothers recruited, 65% were of Pakistani heritage. Of those, 64% were married to blood relations, cousins. The majority first cousins, but sometimes second cousins. First cousins are people you share a grandfather, a grandparent with. Second cousins you share a great grandparent with.
Hmm.
The majority first cousins, some second cousins, but 64%. So in other words, over half of the Pakistani origin people recruited to Born in Bradford had parents who were uh, blood relations, cousins.
Okay.
Now, what we were able to do then was look at those risks for a child having a recessive genetic disorder in the Pakistani population who were married to cousins, in the Pakistani population who were not married to cousins, and in the white British population. And what we found was that the considerable majority, 94 in every 100 children born to people married to cousins did not have a recessive disorder. This is a rare phenomena. Being
Hmm.
married to a cousin increases your chance of having a recessive disorder, but that chance remains a low chance. In this case,
Okay.
it's in 100. Whereas recessive disorders also exist randomly in the population, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second, but randomly in the population, such that just under 3 in every 100 of either the Pakistani people not married to
Hmm.
a person or the white British people were had a child with a recessive disorder. In other words, 97 of those didn't, but three did. So
Okay.
just to recap, because this is fairly complicated. If you're married to a cousin, the chances that your child will have a recessive disorder are about 6 in 100. If you're not married to a cousin, it's around 3 in 100. In other words, your risk is somewhat doubling, but your risk is still overall low.
Okay.
That's a really important figure. What we particularly were able to find in Born in Bradford was that it was the the cousin marriage that was the determining factor. In other words, it wasn't because there was a difference in, say, for example, the levels of poverty, or other medical conditions, or any other sorts of factors, because we were able to compare very similar sorts of populations.
Hmm.
And we were able definitively, I think, and perhaps for the first time, to say this is a consequence of a genetic disorder caused by recessive genes.
Mm. That's really interesting, Neil. So the risk in the general population, therefore, is about 3%,
Yeah, yeah.
and that risk changes to 6% when there's a first or second cousin marriage. Is it for both first and second, or is it for
No, the
first?
rate is slightly higher for first cousins. The rate is higher for first cousins, but the rate also is higher than the average
Okay,
for second cousins.
okay, okay. How does that compare, say, for other behaviors? So, for example, if somebody's having children later, is there a comparative risk for cousin marriages to having children later, or is there no comparison?
There is a comparison in the sense that if you look at overall at recessive disorders, at genetic disorders, what you find is that rates go up in what in medical terms are called older mothers. Um,
Hmm.
in this case, mothers who are giving birth over the age of 34.
Okay.
If you take just that group of mothers over the age of 34, what you find is that the rate of genetic disorders in the children of those mothers is similar to the rate in first cousin marriages within the Born in Bradford cohort. In other words, around doubling of the background risk.
Yeah.
Now, in Born in Bradford, the majority of older mothers were mothers of white British heritage. So what we're finding is that the levels of genetic risk are similar with mothers over the age of 34, in the main white British mothers having a baby with a recessive disorder, to the children of cousins. Um, I think in part the reason why we're finding this in older mothers, white British mothers, is that there tended to be more older white British mothers than there were older Pakistani heritage mothers. In other words, the Pakistani heritage mothers, on average, were younger
Okay.
white British mothers. But there is a similar risk for white British mothers over the age of 34.
Well, that's quite an interesting finding, isn't it? In the sense that um, both both practices carry similar levels of risk, and that's important for scientific reasons. But the media interest has not focused on that side at all, has it? Oh, has it at all?
I think those of us that have been involved in the sort of media coverage of this have tried to make that point. And the point I think we're trying to make is not to talk down the significance that if you're increasing the risk, what we're talking about here is some of the genetic diseases are some of the genetic disorders have very serious consequences. They have
Hmm.
very serious impacts on the child, and we would not want to undervalue that. We would
Hmm.
also want to say that genetic disorders have a range of different causative factors, and there's not a simple and single one-stop cures-all solution to this.
Yeah.
This is a phenomena of the fact that we inherit genes from each of our parents, and we all carry with us some damaged genes. It's one of the phenomena of our physiology, and those
Mhm.
damaged genes increase as the parents are getting older.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Neil. Let's try and unpack that because I think that will be of much interest to the listeners. So, what exactly do we mean by recessive genes? Because it sounds like that's more important than having a cousin marriage. It's the fact that there's a recessive gene risk. Tell us a little bit more about that. How does that work in practice as far as what we're concerned about, which is the science of how it impacts children who are likely to come into this world?
Right. And you're right. It is what we're really talking about is a genetic risk, not a community practice in a sense. The risk is to do with the genes that we have, because, as I've said, most considerable majority of people having children who are cousins will not have a child with a recessive disorder. So we need to unpick and understand what it is about genes that are important here. Now, and bear with me, we each inherit a set of genes from our father and from our mother.
Hmm.
Um, and the child is born with a combination of those two sets of genes. If one gene is damaged, say a gene in the father, but the gene in the mother is healthy, the child will be born with the healthy gene. If both genes are damaged in some sort of way, the child has an increased chance, it's not a certainty, but an increased chance that they will be born with a recessive genetic disorder. Now, cousins share about an eighth of their genes. You, we all across the UK have at any one time, this varies by different sorts of factors. We've just talked about age as one of them, have about two damaged genes in our bodies. That's just the way it is, and it's a sort of secret of evolution that the baby inherits the positive rather than the negative genes. So if your genes, the genes that you have in your body, are more similar because you're a blood relation, then the chances of the baby inheriting the disease go up. It's a simple sort of odds calculation. There's more likely that those genes will be shared, so therefore more likely that the child will be born with a recessive genetic disorder. So these are, in a sense, single gene defects, things that are coming from one defect in the genes that you inherit from mother or father, that manifests itself in some of the children when parents have the same damaged gene.
Yeah. So it's because cousins are more likely to share the same recessive gene than they are likely to have a recessive gene compared to somebody else in the general population. That's what generally increases that risk. Is that the best way to? Yeah.
That's exactly it. That's at the heart of this. It's the fact that you're more likely to have a shared genetic, parts of your genetic makeup will be shared. And just because this is the way genetic makeup are constituted, some of those will be damaged. What we've done is we've gone back to the born in Bradford population,
Hmm.
and looked again at births, and this time between the period of 2016 and 2019.
Okay.
So more recent, about 8 or 9 years later than
Hmm.
the actual study. And what we did is we've looked at the same demographic, the same sorts of people from within the city of Bradford. We've asked them the same sorts of questions, and we've come up with some surprising and important results. Principally, what we've found is that over those 8 or 9 years, the rates of cousin marriage have declined markedly in
Okay.
people of Pakistani heritage. So by the second cohort, that's 9 years later than the first, the overall rates of cousin marriage in the Pakistani heritage population had gone down to 46%, as opposed to the 64% 9 years previously. That's a pretty big drop, a pretty big and steep change in
Hmm.
what was a long established community practice in a relatively short number of years. Now, even more important, some groups within that population had an even lower rate of cousin marriage. And that was particularly the case with younger people, younger women, those under the age of 25, particularly those under the age of 25 that had continued in education, had been born in the UK or had come to the UK as small children, had rates that were around 23% uh, first cousin marriage or cousin marriage.
That,
Um,
that's fast. That's fast. Sorry, I interrupted. Carry on. Yeah.
I'm sorry, and as I'm trying to both deal with my winter cold, excuse me, and just glance down at my figures on my desk to make sure I don't make a mistake. And I actually have just made a mistake. The figures for under 25s, those born in the UK and those who stayed in education to A level or beyond is 28%. So overall, if the figure is 46, in that younger group, it's 28%. So we've got a considerable change in a relatively short number of years in that Bradford population. Now, it might be that this is something specific to Bradford, but it might also be that we're seeing a trend of a reduction in cousin marriage in this population and in populations like this across the UK and possibly across the world.
That's quite a marked drop, isn't it? In a very short period of time, and the two birth cohorts are not many decades apart. They're quite within the same time period, you could argue. Um, have you looked into the reasons through any kind of qualitative research as to what might be some of the explanations behind the drop, as it were?
We have, and I think that there are some external factors. There have been some changes in immigration law, which have made it harder for international marriages for people coming to the UK, to Bradford for marriage. The impact of the immigration law is probably a little later than would be significant for the sorts of findings that we have. It seems much more that there is something going on that's around this sort of shift towards spending more time in education, delaying the date of marriage, and making choices that are about partner choices that are determined by the young people themselves rather than shaped by family expectations or the result of family pressures. In other words, a sort of growth of um, a sort of active taking a lead by young people themselves. And maybe that's linked to education, to um, the sorts of life chances that they're seeing for themselves and the sorts of opportunities that they're having for mixing within Bradford society. Um, More generally, we've not found it particularly reflected by any particular change in the socio-economic characteristics of people. That seems pretty similar. Um, but it certainly is the case in the sort of demographics of what young people are doing in terms of staying on in school, going to college, making those sorts of choices for themselves. We don't know. I think in part involved in your question is we don't know um, the extent to which people are getting to be more aware and are making decisions because they're more aware of genetic risk. When we do talk to people, and we have within Born in Bradford, you've done it yourself. When we do talk to people in Born in Bradford, we do find a sort of sense that people know about genetic risk, probably to a greater degree than they did previously, but they also at times make have fairly complex discussions about the significance of genetic
Hmm.
risk.
Hmm.
Which is a difficult
Yeah.
to get your head around. If we're saying that you're increasing your chances of having a recessive disorder, but people who are not cousins are having recessive disorders anyway, because it's randomly distributed across the population, it's quite a difficult one to get over to people. It's the sort of low probability balanced against serious consequences were there to be a baby with a recessive disorder.
Yeah, no, that's important that you highlight that. There's a multitude of reasons perhaps why rates are dropping, and it might not just be down to people's greater awareness about recessive genetic disorders. It might just be cultural changes, and it may just be changes in how people want to sort of mix with others and stay in education longer and possibly even marry a partner outside of what was considered their own family networks. So I guess all those things are at play, but I suppose there must be something in it about changing attitudes towards cousin marriages as well.
Yes, I think so. People tell us now that excuse me. People tell us that the sorts of customary practices that they would have seen their parents and their grandparents accept as the appropriate thing to do are being questioned, and people are seeing cousins more as siblings rather than as marriage partners. They're finding the idea of marriage within the family, within the extended family, as something a little out of the ordinary for the way they see their own lives and assess their wants for their future. Um, Now, what they're not saying, and I think this is important, is they're not saying when we do talk to people about why people marry cousins, they marry cousins for reasons that are to do with family stability and for community stability. And those things are important. They're certainly particularly important for people who migrate to a different country, who are looking for the sorts of supports that enable them to establish and lead full and fulfilling lives in that new community. So the degree of community support is important for that. It's also the case that community and extended family support are in themselves helpful for the bringing up of children, of healthy and happy children. It's a complicated and demanding job, bringing up your children, as you know, uh, as many people will know. And to have people around you that can support you in that sort of way, both emotionally, practically, financially, are very important. And social support and solidarity is good for child health. So there are some positive benefits in these sort of
Yes. Yeah.
networks of support. But I think people now, younger people now, are beginning to say, how can I get that degree of extended family and community support without marrying a cousin? And I think that the answer that they tell us is that they want to still marry with the blessing and support of the family, but with a wider range or wider scope for individual choice on their part. And that is a social change. It's one that perhaps is consistent with those sorts of choices about staying in education, about being able, in that sense, to be more optimistic about being able to support oneself through one's own occupation, earning capacity in the future. That gives you a little bit of autonomy from the very great importance of the extended family and the community, particularly in hard times.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said about that, isn't there? Because people's health is affected in a huge way by their social solidarity and community networks, and having a supportive community around you who you share an identity with really bolsters that. I just wondered if we carry on looking at data for, birth rates in Bradford and possibly other birth cohorts, is your projection that this will continue to decline? In other words, will cousin marriages continue to decline based on the two birth cohort studies that we've got?
Yes, my guess is that it will. We've had a little look at some data, and the data suggests, because we're now, 6 years on from the last recruitment for the cohort study,
Mm.
so we were able to sort of get anecdotal, observational data that would suggest that where we'd seen a majority of marriages being cousins back in 2007 and in the generations before that, and it going down to slightly less than half by 2016, 2019, that trajectory has continued to fall. So it's becoming um, less common to marry a cousin than it is to not marry a cousin. And we are, in that sense, potentially as a sort of tipping point in which the norm becomes to not marry a cousin, whereas the norm one generation ago would be the expectation to marry a cousin would be a strong one, and many people would see the benefits and strengths of that and go along with that. This is that one of those potential tipping points in social change where the consensus begins to shift, and in this case, that's a change in consensus that has a relevance for the pattern of recessive genetic disorders and for the ill health of that small group of children who are affected by them.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, Neil. And I suppose we've focused today on the science and the data and what we're seeing and what we're observing from the available data. Many of the listeners will be interested in understanding what kinds of help is available to people who are, let's say, concerned about this or want to find more information or wish to know what the health service will provide. Do you think it'd be useful for us to perhaps get a geneticist on or a genetic counselor on to answer some of those kinds of questions?
I do, and let's just go through a few of the things that there are around at
Mm,
the moment. We are much more we have much more knowledge about and much more familiarity with the notion of the genome, with mapping
mhm.
genetic makeup. It's the subject of a great deal of scientific and medical interest, and we're learning more and more about that. Within that, I think it's rare for a week to go by that there isn't some sort of talk about a new genetic intervention, a new intervention in our genetics that are making the or has the potential for great improvements in our health. I think what we've got to do to make sure that we are informed when we are faced with issues around genetics and our own health is become much more genetically literate. And I think we do that by potentially talking in schools about genetics as part of the sorts of social and health education that goes on in schools so that we're informed about what genes are, what they can do, what they can't do. Genes don't determine everything, they interact with environment and with lifestyle choices, but things that genes can do. So we're more informed citizens to make choice about the sorts of questions that we're going to be asked about our own healthcare as genetics become even more important. So there's, I think, an important background social issue where we need to get to grips with that, or in a sense, the science will go too fast for us to keep our understanding up to the level that we need. So that's a sort of background point to make. The second is that the health service is better able now to do genetic testing to test for genetic anomalies. Um, there's much more capacity to screen the whole of the genome to spot the sorts of things that might be problems and advise people accordingly to make choices. Now, in terms of cousin marriage, the idea of looking at one's genetic makeup and the possibility of passing on a recessive gene with a partner and a partner doing the same requires you talking pretty early on in a relationship
Mhm.
to make that sort of choice. It's a difficult thing to do in any circumstance, but it's certainly a difficult thing to do were you to already have been married and then have that conversation, for example.
Yeah.
So I think we need to look at the sorts of genetic testing that we're now able to do, which is much better. Some places are trialing uh, matching genomes in couples so that you can see that sort of thing that I've talked about. We need to counsel people about what the significance of genetic testing is and what are they going to do with this information that they get. Some of the sorts of choices they may be faced with are pretty existential choices. Are they going to choose if they have a high risk of genetic disorders, not to have a child? Are they going to take the chance of continuing with the pregnancy? Are they going to consider termination where things to have been identified in pre-birth and so on? Major sorts of things that we need to be both counseled on and to have testing on in such a way. So you can go to these things through your general practitioner. There are genetic specialist services within communities that can offer that. Bradford have been extremely good at both doing that in the health service and through voluntary sector initiatives around Bradford. There are things online. Not all of them are that helpful, but there are some good resources online that you can go to. There's an increasing concern within the health service and within the government to prioritize more of this sort of genetic literacy in the population, to counter the sorts of myths there are, and to give appropriate advice to people when it's most timely in terms of them making informed life choices. Having said that, it's a fast moving field. There are some really excellent specialists around who can talk about what's going on in Bradford now and what's going on in the wider region and what's likely to be coming down the line to make us both a more genetically informed community and more able to make choices that are most appropriate for us and for our partners and for the lives of our children to come.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Neil. And you highlight something important there, that the anxiety about approaching these conversations once the marriage has happened, one can understand. But I suppose if there are services available that people can access before any union or before any marriage takes place, then that's worth considering. So I guess for a lot of people, there'll be a problem in understanding what is available and how they can access it and how useful it is and what it will do for them. So that's a really important set of questions that I think we should have a little think about, I guess. But yeah,
I mean, in the first instance, your general practitioner can be a guide and a gatekeeper to those sorts of services.
yeah, okay. I think we've spoken for quite long there, and we've covered quite a lot of ground. So, and it's been really interesting. So, thank you for taking the time out to do this, Neil. We'll share this on the Bradford for Better YouTube page, and people will watch it and they'll share it with each other. Is there any final message that you've got for our listeners about Born in Bradford generally, or this subject that we've been talking about? Anything that you want to end this interview on?
I think just to say that, and you've pointed this out in your comments and in your questions, a lot of the significance of Born in Bradford is around the sorts of health education, health information that we generate, the sorts of things that are going to be useful for scientists and for clinicians. But the really exciting thing about a study based in one city running over so many years is the way it can mobilize populations into understanding the causes of ill health and the way that we can respond in such a way that augments our health. In other words, it's about developing across a city a conversation about what we can do to remedy those things that are harmful and to build on those sorts of positive things in our community that will improve our health and well-being. Birth cohort cities studies based in cities are more than the sum of their parts. They, in a sense, sort of just to borrow a sort of image here, they change in a way the sort of DNA of the city. We would hope, and they change it in a way that's for the positive. Born in Bradford does that, I think, and the lessons from this study can both shape the health in this city and in cities across the world that are like this.
Brilliant. That's a really positive way to end this interview, Neil. Again, thank you so much for your time, and we will all be positive in trying to change the DNA of the city for the better. So, I've thank you very much. Take good care. Bye.
Goodbye.
B4BTV. Real people, real stories, real Bradford.